A couple weeks back, some friends and I were having a party at the house, and we were playing a reverse Q&A game. I think most of you have heard me talk about these. It's instead of a bunch of people asking one person a question, one person says a statement, and then the whole crowd answers that statement. But we were playing this game, and the statement came up: political issues should be talked about at church. And because I'm a part-time contrarian, I was on the strongly agree side all by myself. Everyone else was on the other side. Being the person by myself, I had to give my statement first. And my reasoning for being on that side was that all issues have a way of becoming political. Everyone on the other side said, yeah, you're muddying the water too much. And they said no to political talk in church because ministers are not qualified to talk about political things. I couldn't disagree with that too much. And those are two different fields. Still stayed on that side, though. But it really got me thinking, and I spent several days thinking about that subject. And I should first clarify, I mean politics in churches and social politics, not party politics, so don't get those two things confused. But I want to take this opportunity today to monologue to a captive audience, which is a very strange thing. And I want to share with you my opinion on something. This is a view of something. And if you want to throw vegetables, that's your business. I am not going to speak authoritatively on this subject, but I want to talk today about faith, but from a very unusual perspective. I want to talk about faith today in the terms of competence. So to start, I actually want to see a show of hands of this because I can modify if I need to, but I think my assumption is correct that we all in this room share some sort of belief that God's people are called to be set apart for some sort of servant or authoritative role. Is that the kings and priests? Do we all somewhat agree with that? Okay. I was pretty sure we all stood the same on that. All right. When I was really young, I was one of those kids who listened at church. And I remember a good deal of the messages from the time I was about 6 years old on. And something stuck in my head, even that young, not as like a red flag, because I couldn't really process it, but it was something just really sat in my mind. And that was a doctrine that at the resurrection, God will fill people with all the tools and knowledge and understanding and wisdom necessary to do a given task. In all the churches I grew up in, that was taught. That's not horribly bad, but it was always added with worldly education can never give you what you need to please God. Or that no amount of education can prepare you for what God has in store for you. Now, this doctrine was a little bit malleable, and it was often used at cross purposes to bring about obedience and things like that, but for the most part, this was pretty standard. I was taught there's no reason to learn about politics at all because God's government is different. I was taught there is no reason to socially or politically fight against things like abortion, let's say, because God doesn't care about abortion in the United States. He cares about the sanctity of life in the kingdom. I was taught that there's no value in a university education in things like sociology or psychology because that's just gobbledygook and man's just messing up his understanding of man. I was told that there's no reason to pursue education in like city planning and design and things like this because the kingdom was going to be different and everything that I needed I would get when I got there. Now this really, really stuck with me when I was a little kid. And then in my 20s, it really started to bother me because I started my first company in my 20s and I started hiring people. And it occurred to me in several different ways that what people show up with to a job is very, very important. I learned the difference between I've been doing this for 5 years and I'm a quick learner. Those two things are not the same thing. In this, I was taught, as probably some of you were taught as well, that we are not and cannot, as humans, be good enough for God. There's an idea that's extremely pervasive in Christianity as a whole that man cannot please God. Now, no doubt there's some scriptural basis for this concept, but the application gets so far outside of bounds and context that Christianity believes some pretty strange things. Now, there is a distinction made in the Bible between physical and spiritual. The flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Okay. Does that mean, though, that man cannot please God? And more importantly, does that mean that worldly or physical education, talents, experiences, actions, strengths, weaknesses, and things like that are immaterial to the plan of God? I want to start looking at some biblical stories. And first, are there heroes in the Bible? Do we see heroes in the Bible? Men and women who did great things? Were all of those exploits just God using people like a hammer or a pencil? I heard a minister say when I was a kid, he said, Samson didn't kill 3,000 Philistines with a jawbone. God killed 3,000 Philistines with a Samson. Is that true? Is every heroic story in the Bible God flexing? Let's go to Hebrews 11. I went paper this time. All right. As we start reading the first section of Hebrews 11, there's a majority opinion in Christianity that faith and belief are something akin to feelings. They're passive. Faith and belief are seen as the ability to stand still, to be patient, to be hopeful, to be at internal peace, to be convicted or convinced of something. Let's go to Hebrews 11. In verse 1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony, or in the ESV it says, were commended. What does it mean to have evidence of something? What is evidence? In one of my older Bibles, I didn't bring it today, but I have some strange markings in Hebrews. The top of the page on Hebrews 11 wrote one of my favorite words. It's verb. And then I highlighted every action that's associated with faith. And then also highlighted God's response to every one of those things. If you want to read along with me, I'm going to read Hebrews 11, and I've printed out the New King James here, but the emphasis that I read it with is my own. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. By faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts. And through it, he being dead, still speaks. By faith, Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place that he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. All these died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were assured of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind the country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And when he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, "In Isaac your seed shall be called," concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each one of his sons, each one of the sons of Joseph, and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instruction concerning his bones. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. For he looked toward the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. I wonder if I took that part. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. What more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of aliens. Women received their dead back to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trials of mockings and scourgings, yes, of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, tempted, slain by the sword, wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens, in the caves of the earth. All these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. How many actions are associated with faith there? How passive does faith look in that account? Was God just using people as tools in all those cases? We're going to do a little experiment. Let's imagine a couple of scenarios. First, there's a house fire. There's 2 people outside the house. Both are aware there are children inside that burning house. One kneels in prayer, confident that God can save children from fire. The other runs into the house and pulls the children out. Which one of those gets remembered for faith? Another scenario. There's a flood. In the aftermath of the flood, there's a literal mountain of debris in a neighborhood. The local church in the neighborhood holds a fast and a prayer meeting. The same weekend, the motorcycle club shows up with shovels and rakes and wheelbarrows. Who shows more faith? Now, you can laugh at these 2-dimensional or 1-dimensional stories, and these are me just throwing something out there. I'm not going to say that there's no faith on either side, but which one gets remembered? Which one gets noticed? Which one gets written down later? The fact is that the real world happens in these very simple, flat dimensionless questions, these opportunities where things have to happen. Very rarely do we get to be righteous by thinking about something. And unless we ignore the plain words of Hebrews 11, man's actions can be pleasing to God. And in this account, most of the things that are commendable are man's own actions. So let's explore some of these stories a little bit deeper and see if all of these stories were just miracles where God took a passive, ignorant, incompetent, untrained person and moved mountains with him. I ask this because it's a good group of friends of mine in another church, and they have a slogan right now that says, "God's got this." I don't have any problems with that. But it's commonly used in conjunction with "be still and know that I am God." And we need to keep doing what we're already doing. I want to go back to Moses because Moses is it's got personal significance for me. I don't think most of y'all didn't know my mom, but my mom was a planner and a negotiator. She ran feast sites and church camps and things like this. And I got to see from watching her plan things that there's a big problem with the extreme side of God's got this. At the time of the Exodus, it's estimated there were somewhere around 3 million Hebrews. I could be way off, could be accurate, but there was a lot of people. Do any of you know how to communicate with 3 million people? I don't think so. I watched my mom learn the skills of event planning and communication. She could accurately calculate how much food and how much space and how much lodging and all this kind of thing that, say, 400 or 500 people needed. And it took a long time for her to learn those skills. But I dare say that most of us here, even with internet and phones, if we had to get a clear message to 3 million people, we wouldn't know the first place to start. And I doubt we could accomplish it. How big is 3 million people? Like, how much space does that take up? How much food does 3 million people eat? How quick can they move? Moses was just an uneducated person, right? You know the answer to this. He was a prince. He grew up trained as a prince in a palace that reigned over something like 6 or 7 million people. He actually had an education in how to do that. He knew what that looked like. He knew how communication worked. Now you could say that was God preparing him, and that is fair enough. I completely accept that. But as we go on, I think you'll see it's going to prove my point. He had a worldly education in political things and physical things that were necessary to be able to do the job that God had to do. And God was pleased with him for doing it. What about Samuel? Samuel is a very interesting character. I have a tongue-in-cheek favorite scripture where Samuel hacks Agag into pieces before the Lord at Gilgal and delivers a Clint Eastwood line of, As your sword made women childless, so will your mother be. Very interesting character. Samuel was a kingmaker. He was the man in charge of foreign policy above the king. He was also a judge. There's a decent amount of evidence he wrote, or at least rewrote, large portions of what we call the Old Testament. Anyone can do that, right? What was his background? From 6 years old or so, maybe a little younger, maybe a little older, he was trained by Eli. And in his adulthood, there wasn't a man in all of Israel who knew the words of God as much as Samuel did. He was very educated and carried out political exploits that also pleased God. What about Esther? I encourage you to go read this story. This is not a G-rated story at all. The count we have is kind of muted, but there's a lot of content in there. Here's an entirely political situation in which a woman was trained by some professionals and used her newly acquired and apparently exceptional skills, human skills, to save a whole race of people. You should think about that and read the story sometime, because it's not what we might think it is. When you read the story, you also find that probably a man couldn't have done that job. What about Paul? Here's the scene for Paul. There's a paradigm shift in the world. Judaism's time as a sort of torchbearer, let's say, is over. There's a new and better covenant made. There's a need to spread the gospel. And it needs to be spread through the world and proclaimed so good that people from now on will know about it. Who's the most capable of doing that? Just a random person with no education, right? No. The person who gets the most credit for spreading the gospel, at least in the stories that we have and in the history that we have, is Paul. And he was not uneducated. Not by a long shot. He was personally trained at one of the most prestigious academies, you could say, of Jewish teaching at the time. Not only that, he was a practicing member of the Jewish ruling community. He was quite literally a religious lawyer. And it is specifically by his education and his experience that he was able to reach the audience that he did. Just starting out right off the bat, if Paul had not been educated and well-versed in the political system and the social system, he wouldn't have made it out of Antioch. It was his education that afforded him his audience. It was this experience in his trade in tent making that supported him. And it was because of his credentials that his message was even considered. It was his training and prowess in Roman law that opened locked doors. It was also his ability to speak the depths of Greek philosophy and poetry that made him listenable It very much was his education that gave him an audience. What I see, and once again, this is me reading, that all these heroes in the Bible have in common is that they did not only have faith, they were competent and active. They had the experience and education necessary to deal with the issues of their time, and they acted on it. One of my favorite things to think about in the Bible is when Christ said, "He who has the faith of a mustard seed could say to this mountain, be moved, and it would be." When I hear that, I don't think that means the person who sits and waits for God to move a mountain. The person who really has faith that the mountain can move is the person that buys a bulldozer and hires a crew and then gets to moving the mountain. Is that impatient? Some people could easily say that's impatient. Take Abraham, for instance. If you Google the story of Abraham and Hagar, nearly every single commentary there is will say that Abraham sinned, that he was impatient. Nearly every single one. Where does God tell Abraham that he sinned in that story? Does God ever go to Abraham and say, "You need to slow down. I got this"? No, in fact, Abraham goes to God and says, "My wives are fighting, my son's getting mistreated, what should I do?" And God says, "I'll make a great nation out of him too." That'd have been the perfect time to say, "If you hadn't have done what I didn't want you to do," but that's not what he says. He says, "I'll make a great nation out of him too." What we read in Hebrews is that Abraham is remembered as a faithful man because he did. He acted, he lived, he went. The entire book of James, if you'll turn with me, I'm not going to read the entire book of James, but the entire book of James is a treatise on faith being the same thing as the action connected to it. If you go to, Blake was talking about reading the Bible with Western eyes a while back. If you go to James 2:14, we'll read here, it says, "What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and someone says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed and filled,' without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is it? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead." In English, because of the way our language works, we read this and it looks like faith and works are juxtaposed as two different ideas. But when you read through the context as a letter, as it's supposed to be read from start to finish, he's making the case that these two things are one. If you go down further in here to verse 24, it says, "You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way?" It's a very interesting bit right here. He says that the justification comes by the works of faith, basically. We could go on about all of these heroes because they all have stories. And conveniently, from our perspective, as we read these stories, they're all pre-qualified for the job. Is that because of predestination? Did God just have it all planned? Was it Rahab saving spies by hiding them and lying about it? Or was it God who saved spies with a prostitute? So much doctrine is based upon the answer to this question. When Paul talks in amazement about how God knew him before birth, a large portion of Christianity says, that meant Paul's life was planned. Is that the case? One thing we really, really often miss is that the stories here were written after the story happened. Very little of the Old Testament is written in present tense as it's happening. Almost everything was written a good ways after each story. And because of that, they're written in omnipotent voice. The narrator, the person telling the story or writing the story, knows all the relevant details. Got hindsight working. They even know that the person is relevant. But that's not how the story happened. Paul's father didn't wake Paul up one day and say, all right, son, God wants you to do X, Y, Z today, because that's part of the plan. All of these men and women woke up every morning just like you and I do. Do we know exactly what our day is going to be, what we're going to encounter, how God's going to help us through things? We don't know that. And these stories are written with hindsight. Now let's play some historical fiction with that in mind. Let's pretend you're Abraham. And someone who claims to be a minister comes and says, what God really wants for you is just to be still and patient. Don't go learning fancy math. Don't bother with astronomy. Just whatever you do, don't participate in society. Suppose he took that advice. Suppose you're Moses' parents, and someone comes to you and says, it wouldn't be right to resist the government, and God can resurrect your son, so just do whatever they say. God's got this. I don't think that would be the right outcome. Suppose you're Mordecai, and your niece that you raised as a daughter is taken by a king because he likes variety. Your abducted niece manages to write you and says, I've been taken as a sex slave, what do I do? Suppose you said, I'm not sure God can work with the sex slave. Thankfully, he didn't say that. He said something to the effect of, this might be extremely difficult for you, but perhaps you have the right qualifications for the job. Here's where this comes back to us right now. We read these stories. We know most of these stories by heart. And from our perspective, God's right there as a character in the story that we can see, moving things around visible from our perspective. And we see these people and what they did, and that God was with them. And we say, these are heroes. We start to think about them as something other than us. And because of our perspective, we look at these stories and we say, oh, this was just God. This was just God doing all of these things. When we do that, though, we remove all responsibility from ourselves. Without that responsibility, we can just sit and be still, wait for God to use us. When that's not why these stories were recorded. The commendations these heroes received was because they did something. Quite frankly, they did what they could with what they had, the best way they knew how. So what are you going to do about it? I've said this before, it's a very common thing. If God wanted me to pursue this or that thing, he'd make it happen. I don't think that's how it works. I think it can happen that way, but I don't think that's how it works. Do you have an opportunity to become competent in something, to learn about something? Are you turning it down because it's not religious? Are you not interested in some opportunity because there might be some problems with the curriculum and might not be perfect? Is there something in your community or your life or your neighborhood? Is there something that needs doing but you won't do it because you know God can do it better? Think about that. It's really annoying. I'm sure you've probably noticed this before. When you hear religious people in debates, religious people seem to always fall back on belief rather than accepting fact or exploring facts, or everything always comes back down to, I've got faith about it, so I don't need the facts. And then, especially in some organizations more than others, with that belief that we just have to have belief and no action, then we isolate and avoid society, and then we're left with no credentials, no accomplishments, no accolades, no experience, no works to prove our faith. We know we believe. If you go back and Google the William Jennings Bryan and the Scopes monkey trial, this is just a cartoonish version of this kind of thing. This was about evolution being taught in schools, and as you can guess, they lost. Bryan skewered himself all through the arguments, just made an absolute fool of himself and Christianity by just reverting to these horrible, baseless, untenable claims of faith without work and action and fact. At one point, he basically said that freedom of speech only applies to people that agree with him, that kind of thing. This is why even now, today, commentators, I don't want to pick on him, but people like Matt Walsh, on their own platform, they can sound so good and they can say all these things, and then you put them in a room with someone who asks some factual questions or challenges, and they have no answer. And religious people sound like this so often. You've heard sermons of ministers saying that the Greeks worship their gods like Christians worship their God. It's completely not true. And you can make all different kinds of really bad claims based on that understanding. But in a lot of cases, the speakers are just incompetent and unlearned because they were taught some form of learning about pagan religion will dilute you. If you go back through the epistles of Paul, it's literally his knowledge of Greek philosophy and religion and poetry that allows him to communicate with a certain group of people. And it was because he could talk their language that they even engaged in the conversation. This is why my friends in that Q&A that I talked about don't want to hear politics talked about. It's in large part because that which considers itself a religious authority is very often incompetent in political understanding. The same goes for you if you talk to people. The same goes for like child rearing, economic planning, which car manufacturers make the best cars, whether or not to buy Bitcoin. None of these things can be talked about from a position of authority. And yet faith or belief is used as a superpiece, as a credential to talk about things authoritatively. I started by asking if we all subscribe to the basic notion that we'll eventually be in some authoritative office of service. If we believe that, if that's what we're aiming for, I don't think we'll ever get there by being still and waiting for mountains to move for us, because that's not how any of these people ended up there. The notion that worldly education and worldly action is not important is not consistent with the stories we have in the Bible. Each one of us here has a unique path. We have complex lives. We've seen and done very different things. And perhaps that is God moving you around. But I don't think that's like a hammer or God swinging a Samson to kill Philistines. I want to give you an analogy, and I don't suggest this will not break down at some point, but it's something to think about. It looks to me, when I read through these stories, that God is in control. But it's something more like the game of chess. And I say that because chess pieces aren't all the same. And the chess player needs different pieces to do different things. The chess player just moves those pieces around. Perhaps what stands out in these stories is that God's playing chess, let's say, with billions of people who just want to be pawns. Just want to stand still, and I just want to go forward, and I just want to take one step if I have to. Perhaps what stands out is that the castles or the rooks like Abraham took 8 spaces to the left, because that's what God needed to do. And that was the piece that did it. Perhaps the bishops, like Paul, could go from one corner to the opposite corner when no other piece was capable of doing that. Perhaps the queens, like Esther, yielded to what would be illegal moves for any other piece in order to overthrow an opposing king. If you look around the world right now, there's endless trouble. Things are wrong everywhere. Things are broken. People are broken. Things are upside down. Who's going to fix it? Do we not have stories after stories after story of people who just fixed it? They acted. They did things. They got up and they left their comfortable positions. They did the best they could with the tools they had. And we exist because of them. I feel like these Old Testament stories are a comparison of people that don't move and people that do move. So what about the issues today? What about abortion, LGBT rights, Bitcoin, 5G, social media, climate change? All of these things very complex. Perhaps we should learn about the problem. Perhaps we should devote a little bit of time to becoming competent in the subject material that we're surrounded by. I'm not at all suggesting that you go and adopt a different lifestyle, but maybe have some conversations, read some books, figure out how things are working, what people are thinking, how they're moving. And then after learning more about the problems that we're surrounded by, maybe we'll be a little bit more qualified to spitball solutions. Many of my peers, I've known a lot of people my age growing up in the church, turn down opportunities to go to college or university, in a lot of cases to get married, or to take a job path because they were constantly being taught that the end was near, Christ is going to return soon, and when he gets here, you'll get all the things you need. And on top of that, a very heavy dose of doing anything substantial socially or politically in this world would be offensive to God. I hope that's not us. The heroes that we see in the Bible, no doubt, 100%, had God working in their lives and moving them around. But they did not know the extent at the time. They woke up every morning like you and I do. They were normal people, human people, with some skill set, or talent, or conviction, and they used it. If we profess to have the same God who works the same way and have the same faith, perhaps we should act that way. Let's close in Esther. Esther 4:14. You're all going to get there before I do. I'm going to go to Esther 4, verse 14. Now think about this. Like I just mentioned, in light of chess pieces. Think of this in the connection between faith and action. And don't forget to consider the weight of the fact that this man is talking to a girl that he raised as his own daughter. This is not random advice to a disconnected stranger. Esther 4:14. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? There's a big world around us. There's a lot of things that need doing, and God will do them. If not by us, then by someone else. There also will be people remembered for their contributions, just as there always have been. Could it be, would you consider the possibility that perhaps You were prepared for such a time as this.